Welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And today I am here to talk to you about desktop style web apps using Xojo. So web apps. If you've ever made a web app not using Xojo, or you've thought about making a web app, you know that web app development is complex. The user interface can be tricky to put together. You often have to do that by coding the user interface. Multiple technologies are often involved, such as JavaScript, frameworks, the multitude of JavaScript frameworks that are out there that you have to decide on. PHP, HTML, CSS, all these tools often work together to make a single web app, and that can be complicated and difficult for people to work with. People often come to us and say, boy, I wish we could make apps and web apps more quickly. And as I said, just mainstream web development tools are frustrating. People can use them to make web apps, but often it takes a long time and you don't have a lot of fun doing it. So get off the pain train. Xojo is a solution here. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So Xojo is a collection of things. First of all, it's a programming language. This is a modern object-oriented programming language. Syntax is similar to Visual Basic. It's very easy to read. It's very easy to learn. Xojo is also a framework. In this particular case, we're talking about the web framework. And this framework lets you make web apps very, very easily. Xojo is also the integrated development environment that you use to put all this together. So essentially with Xojo, you're using one tool and it allows you to develop faster. Xojo is also free to use. You can download it for free from the Xojo website. Play around with it. There's no time limit on Xojo. You only need to purchase it when you're ready to deploy a web app that you've made. And Xojo's been around since 1998. So getting close to 20 years for the Xojo product to be around. The company's actually been around for 20 years now. And the web version of Xojo has been available since 2010. So when you create web apps with Xojo, the process is pretty simple. And don't worry, we'll be diving in and looking at Xojo itself in just a minute or two. Xojo starts, you choose that you want the web project type. You design your app layout using drag and drop. You write your code. And as I mentioned earlier, Xojo's programming language is similar to Visual Basic. And I also note here that it's similar to Java and Python, primarily in the object-oriented model is also very similar to those two languages. So if you've worked with them, you'll immediately understand how Xojo works. And then you do the typical development process. You run, you test, you debug, you compile, you deploy. But you do that all within the Xojo IDE itself. You don't have to switch between tools. About the only other thing you really need is a web browser, of course. Speaking of deployment, Xojo web apps can be deployed a variety of ways. The first way is standalone apps, standalone deployment, as we call it. And this is an app that has an embedded web server. And when you build your web app using Xojo, you get a folder that has exe and related files, and you can just copy that over to your web server and run it. This is very easy to deploy, particularly on low-cost web server options, such as something like DigitalOcean or Linode. Even Amazon Web Services can run these. And the standalone app you can build for whatever type of server you're using. So if you're using a Linux server, which is by far the most common, then you can build your Xojo app for Linux. And you can build it, of course, for 32-bit or 64-bit versions of Linux, depending on what you're using. But if you happen to be using a web server that is Windows or even Mac OS, you can also build a native Xojo app in those for those operating systems. The next way you can deploy is as through CGI. So this builds a web app that interfaces with your existing web server, Apache in most cases, using a CGI script. Some web servers make this a little bit easier of a deployment option because you can just copy the Xojo app up into the CGI bin folder or something like that, and then your web app is automatically available. You don't have to do anything else. And then the third option that's available is for people that want to avoid having to deal with their own server. If you've ever dealt with a server, you know that that can be a particular pain. Linux servers often require a fair amount of administration, not something everyone is really an expert in. So we also offer Xojo Cloud. And this allows you to deploy your web app right from Xojo itself. Right in the IDE, there's a button called Deploy. You just click that, and your Xojo app is built and uploaded to the Xojo Cloud servers, and then available for people to use. Xojo Cloud is fully managed, so you don't have to do any configuration. You don't have to worry about system updates, any of that stuff. You don't have to worry about security. All that stuff is built in and managed for you. And I got a link here to the Dev Center in the user guide that has a lot more material on deployment options and information. And in particular, for people that want to, maybe if you already have a server and want to test out running a Xojo app on it, you can actually download from here test web apps built for various platforms in 32-bit and 64-bit that you can upload to your server just to do a quick test to make sure everything runs before you purchase Xojo. So what are some of the features of making web apps with Xojo? Well, I mentioned before, Xojo makes actual apps, and in particular, it makes native compiled apps. 64-bit is probably what most people are going to want to use, but Xojo also can compile 32-bit apps. So these are actual exe apps. Xojo doesn't build, a series of scripts that you upload to the web server that then, someone could actually download and read. There's no source code available. It's an actual compiled app. And these are some of the UI controls that Xojo has built in. Not really all of them, but list here you can see. We'll see that also in Xojo when we look at that in a moment. So of course there's buttons and toolbars and menus and pop-up menus and all the usual stuff. In particular, Canvas is a useful one for drawing graphics. There's controls for displaying text and movies and all kinds of stuff. And there's also, I don't think I listed on here, containers that allow you to combine a collection of controls into a kind of a reusable control that you can put on multiple pages and stuff like that. Lots of flexibility there. In addition, you can make your own custom controls using the Xojo Web Software Development Kit. And this essentially is a way for you, if you happen to be familiar with other JavaScript UI frameworks, you can use the Web SDK to integrate those into Xojo so that you can use them in your own Xojo web apps as well as the built-in controls. Xojo can also consume web services, of course, and it can also be used to serve web services. So a Xojo web app can provide web services for other types of apps, iOS apps, desktop apps, other web apps. And of course, Xojo has great database support built in. Commonly used databases are SQLite, MySQL, and Postgres. Xojo has support for others as well, depending on the platform you're using. SQLite is a nice, lightweight, easy-to-use database. It doesn't require a separate database server installation, which is very nice. It's good for light to medium load websites. All right, let's switch over and take a look at Xojo. All right, I'm going to create a new project here. So you can see Xojo create lots of different project types. We're going to be focusing on web, of course. So you can see I just select web from the list here, I give it an initial app name, click OK, and I'll get a blank window with my editor. And now you can see this is the primary design area for Xojo. So you can see by default, your web project comes up and you've got only 3 items in your project. A global app item, good place to put global properties or functions or stuff like that. You've got a session class, which is used to track session-specific information for each user that connects. So, if you're saving the username of a particular logged in user, you can save that in the session, or any other information that's specific to the currently connected user, but not all the users. And then by default, Xojo gives you an empty web page that you can start working with. And you can see it kind of looks like a generic browser here in the editing area. This is the layout editor. And you can see on the right all the controls in the library. And you can just hover over a control, click on it to drag it over to the web layout area, use the alignment guides that appear to position things where you want. Xojo web apps, because it allows you to create apps that work and function like desktop apps, everything is absolutely positioned. So wherever you put it here is where it's going to pretty much stay on the page. So you get exact layout. So here I'm just going to drag over a couple little controls. This will be a little simple demo. So you can see I've added just 2 controls, a button and a label. And I gotta lower this a little bit so I can see the whole part of the screen. Over on the right here, I can switch over to the inspector and I can see the properties for whatever happens to be selected. So in this case, it's the button. And I can do things like change the name, and the caption that shows up on the text. I can click on the label and do the same thing. And you can see as you change various properties, the little preview in the layout editor updates. So you kind of get a rough idea of what that might look like when you actually get around to running and testing it. Now, this little rinky-dink app is just going to show you that when the button's clicked, we'll just increase the number of, we'll show the number of times the button's been clicked here in the label. Now, adding code to a Xojo web app is really nice. It's very similar to how you work with Xojo desktop apps. It's all event-based. So I can just click on the button and, well, I want something to happen when the button itself gets clicked, when the user is using it. So I want to add an event to the button. So I can click on the button. I can actually just double click on the button, or I can come to the menu here and pick Event Handler. There's a variety of events that I can choose. The action event is the one that is called when the button itself is clicked. So let's just take that one. And that opens us up in the code editor, where we can put code that will run when the button is clicked. Now, before I put any code here, I want to track the clicks. And one way to do that is to create some sort of variable that will be available each time this event is called. And an easy way to do that is to create a property on the web page. So I've added a property there. And I can just call it number of clicks, leave its type as integer, because that's just going to be a counter. And then I can click back on the action event handler there in the navigator to get back to the code editor. And now I can type some code. So here I can say some pretty obvious code. And I can convert that to a string and set that as, oops, I missed that there, set that as the text of the label. So just a couple quick lines of code here so you can see how that all works. So that's what I have for the simple page. So now if I want to test these things, it's really easy. You just press the run button. And it'll quickly do a build of your app and then launch it in your default browser. And then you can see the layout on here. And as I click the button, you can see the events getting called and it's updating the value. You can see also in the tab, it says Untitled because we didn't actually give our page itself a name for the title. See, we left it here as Untitled, but any name we want to put here is what would show up in the tab or the window, depending on how your browser is set up. So as you can see, that was pretty easy with Xojo to put together something. You didn't have to jump into a bunch of different files and hook things up together, go to different things. If I wanted to tweak, how this text might look, I can add something to Xojo called a web style, which works similar to CSS, but you don't have to remember all the specific things. And I can do things like set a specific color, do whatever I want for properties to change the style. And then back on the web page design in the properties, I can come down to the style and just choose the style there and it gets used. So, a lot of the low-level stuff that you might have to mess around with, if you're familiar with making web apps using other tools, you can, get an easier way to use it and work with it when you're working with Xojo. And as you can see, I talked about some of the controls here. There's a segmented control. You've got toolbar that lets you add a toolbar anywhere you want on the page. Lots of typical controls you'll see here. You've also got other things you can add to the project using insert up here, including images, of course, classes, all that good stuff. Container controls allow you to group a bunch of controls together and then just drop that container onto pages. Your web app can, of course, consist of multiple pages as you jump between them however you want. And the layout, again, nice and particular, looks very similar to a desktop app, which can be very helpful for people that need more powerful web apps to do their business or whatever. Now let's take a look at a couple other more sophisticated projects. This here, I'll just run this first and then we'll look at it, is an example of a quick project that is processing something maybe you heard of recently, this new JSON feed concept. And here I have a link to the JSON feed for Daring Fireball. And if I click the load button, you'll see that it pulled down the JSON feed from there, gave a list of the most recent posts on Daring Fireball, which I can then click on, and then the content for that post is shown down below. And you can see how that kind of looks like a desktop app. I'll get you the link in a moment, but this is a blog post that actually went up on the Xojo blog earlier today that has step-by-step instructions on how to make this app, which just has a few, I think like 15 or 20 lines of code. Not a lot of code, and but I can show you what some of that looks like right now. So see here, I've switched back to Xojo. The same thing here. This project just has a single web page in it. And you can see the layout of the web page has a few more things here. Still a label and a button. Now there's a text field here in the middle where you can type the URL to the feed. Another big label here that shows the feed title. Here is a list box. And this here is an HTML viewer. Let me turn on the inspector so you can see the properties as I click on those. So you can see the list box has 2 columns, and then an HTML viewer, which is showing the contents of the post. You might notice this particular page is actually pretty small, but when we ran it, it kind of stretched to fill, the entire area that was available in the web browser. And that is done using these locking controls here. So you can see this post viewer, the HTML viewer, is locked to all 4 edges of the browser. So this means it will stretch as the browser is resized up or down. So that allows you to, handle how the controls will appear and be positioned with different browser sizes. And if you look at the code for this, there's only 3 places where there are code. The load button is called when the user actually taps on the button. And you can see here, this is calling a send method. The dot indicates call a method on this particular object. We'll look at that object in a moment, but it's saying call the send method, do a HTTP GET, and then supply the URL that the user typed in. The list box has an event for selection changed. This is called whenever a new row or whenever a row is clicked on the list box. And this gets the content that is saved in the list box for each row and tells the article viewer to load that content so it's displayed. Very simple code there. And most of the code is in the feed socket, which if you're looking at the web page, you can see is down here because it's not a visual control. This is actually a HTTP socket for communicating with things on the internet. And this has some code in the page received event. So the load button calls the send method on this socket, and that's a built-in method of the socket. And that sends essentially a request out to the internet that says, at this URL, send me back some information. When that information is received, this event is called, and it contains the information. So here we make sure that valid information was returned. That's HTTP status 200. And then we convert that information from data back down to text. We then convert that text, which we know to be JSON, into a JSON dictionary. We clear the list box, set up the title, and then loop through the specific values in the JSON data and add it to the list box. A very simple code. The JSON feed data actually has more information than what I'm pulling out of here. This is kind of the minimum that you need to show things, but there's other things in there, such as URLs, and I don't even remember offhand. There's a full spec of JSON feed online that has all the information, but you can choose to parse what you want for display or tracking. And that's it for code for JSON feed. It's a pretty simple app, but it does something kind of useful. And right now it's just showing the JSON feed for a single URL. But this is the sort of thing that, well, you could decide you want to beef this up a bit more. And you could maybe put another list box over to the left that shows, so you can save multiple feeds from multiple sites. And then as you click on a site, it shows you the feeds for that site. You could update this with a database to save the feeds, to track the ones you've read. All kinds of cool stuff you could start adding to this as you play around. All right, I got one question here before I move on to the next project I want to quickly show you. And Carl is asking, what's the difference between a property and a variable? Well, that's not really web specific. That's more of a general programming thing. But essentially, if you look at something that has more code, a property is what you would add using the property thing. And that essentially is a value that's accessible to its main container, which in this case would be the web page. And then a variable is something that you declare within a method or an event, and that's only available within the method or event. So you can see here, this would be a variable. It's created using dim, and it's available for the duration of this event. But once the event ends, that variable disappears. Its memory that it uses freed up, that sort of thing. As to which you should use, well, that's kind of a general programming thing, but generally you want to keep things in your local events or methods. You want to start with variables because most often that stuff isn't need to be retained outside of the method or event. But if it does need to be retained for some reason, that's when a property can come in handy. All right, and let's jump into a slightly bigger project here. This is our Eddie's Electronics web example, and I'll just run this here. And an even more complicated layout. You can see there's a list box here on the left, search field in the toolbar at the top of the screen, which has buttons that I can click. Clicking the sales report button loads a new web page that has a giant canvas on it where this graph is drawn. There's a button that lets you return back. There is a giant area that shows a map of the location for the customer and a list here of their invoices. I can click on them. I can double click on them to get a dialog that drops down that shows the specifics of the invoice, including what's on it and its amounts. So it does quite a few different things. This actually has a database behind it that contains all this information. SQLite database, actually. And I will not go through a lot of this code because there is a fair amount here, but you can start to see how a larger Xojo project starts to look. And it still doesn't become one of those complicated messes that you see in other tools where you've got files all over the wazoo. Here, this is just organized with a few folders. Most of the UI stuff is in the UI folder. As I click on the various things, you can see the layouts for them. Pretty good approximation of what they actually look like when they're running in the browser. There is a folder of various styles to get, for how things want to look. As I mentioned earlier, there's a folder of the graphics, folder of some various controls that need to be customized a little bit, and then a folder containing the database access class, which has on it a bunch of methods. And here is where all the methods are that essentially connect to the database and pull information back so that the web app can display it. And to give you an example of what something like that might look like, let's go into here and set a breakpoint. So I opened up the code for the selection changed event of customer list. So this is what is called when you click on a customer in that list. And I clicked here in the gutter on one of the dashes and it put a little red dot. That's a breakpoint. So this means when we run this project next time, when this code gets called, when this line of code is specifically called, Xojo will drop into its debugger and you can actually see what's going on. And it did that for the first row. So I'm going to let it just come up and then we're going to pick a random one here. And you'll see that it called that event. It had run all the code up to here, and now it got to this line with the breakpoint and it stopped. And now we're in the debugger where we can see things like the, I guess this particular thing doesn't have any specific variables, but you can see the list box right here, which I could click on and see its properties. You could see itself, which is the page, which I could click on and see its properties. I can use the buttons up here to step over things, step into things, so I could step into that particular method. Whoops, I think I meant to hit the other one next to it. I want that one. So here we stepped into the particular method. And you can see the local variable right here shows up down here. I can step through this line by line, watch its values change, click on things to see values. So super easy to debug and work with your Xojo web projects, which is, again, another tricky thing that can be for most people that are working on web apps. All right, so that is kind of a high level of 3 different projects I wanted to show you made with Xojo, 3 different web projects. So let's jump back here. So the Eddie's Electronics example is that last one we were looking at. You can actually go to demos.xojo.com and use that live. We have a version of that hosted on Xojo Cloud. You can play around with that. Also, if you do download Xojo, or you already have Xojo, you can head on over into the examples and then click on sample applications. And there's an Eddie's Electronics folder there that contains the Eddie's Electronics web example. You can also head over to the demo site to run the JSON feed example, which is published up there. It has the -dev at the example because I didn't publish that as a final build or anything. It's a dev build. I also briefly earlier mentioned that you can use Xojo for web services. And a web service is essentially something on the web that provides information back. You ask it a question, send it, some information, and then it sends you data back, often in the JSON format. That's a text format that is pretty easy to parse and process. And we have a live demo of a web service that outputs data from the Eddie's Electronics database. You can read about that in the Dev Center. And you can see an example of it at this URL. So I'm just going to click this here. I think that should open up in Safari. So you can see I just called the web service using my web browser, and I got back a bunch of JSON of all the customers that are in the database. Actually, it's probably not all. I think maybe it is all. But you can see this is what JSON looks like. A lot of these little squirrely brackets are in there to denote a specific item or an object. And then you get the individual fields that are in there with their values. So you can see first name, Abdul, last name, McConnell, and city, state, blah, blah, blah. And now normally you wouldn't want to look at this in a web browser, of course. You would have another app that made this call, got this data back, and then is parsing out this data to display in a more appropriate format for whatever you happen to be doing. But we do have this test app up there to give you one way to, test something out without having to necessarily create your own web service. And if you just head over to blog.xojo.com, you can read the JSON feed article, which just came out today. So actually, you probably don't need the full URL, just blog.xojo.com will show it. So really, the bottom line here is that you should probably be using Xojo. There's more than 200,000 other users around the world that are already using Xojo. And remember, Xojo is a great way to make web apps, but it's not just for web apps. Xojo can make lots of other apps. It can, of course, make desktop apps. And that means apps for Windows, for Mac OS, for Linux, for Raspberry Pi. It can also make iOS apps for iPhones, for iPads, all using the single Xojo tool, in addition to making web apps. So it's a great way to be much more productive. And often you might find that you've built an app for one sort of thing and you want the companion for the other platform. You might find that you want to use the web component to build a web service that you need an iOS app to access. You might find you built the desktop app and then you're like, you know what? Customers might also get some value from a web app that maybe I can sell differently and sell using subscriptions or something like that. And when you use Xojo for that, you don't really have to start from scratch. Often there's a bunch of code you can reuse. So important thing to keep in mind. Like we say, Xojo lets you develop faster. I mentioned Xojo is free to use. You can just download it from Xojo.com, start playing around, working on your app. You only need to purchase Xojo when you're ready to deploy. So you can get started today. I'll point out a few resources for you. Of course, the download page, sojo.com/download. If you're new to making apps or need a refresher because you haven't done it in a while, we have a free book, Introduction to Programming, which you can grab at xojo.com/learn. We also encourage everyone to take advantage of our great user community using the Xojo user forum, forum.xojo.com. Lots of activity there, great place to ask questions. People are friendly. Surprising how quickly questions get answered. It's amazing. Great place to hang out. The Xojo Dev Center also has all the documentation you could spend days reading. That's at developer.xojo.com. The user guide is also available. And in addition to web material, you can also head over to the Web Tech Info page, which has lots of specifics on web-related articles and topics. And if you buy right now, you can save 10% using the code Xojo10. Now I'm at paul@xojo.com. If you have a question after this webinar, after you've watched the webinar that you want to send me, by all means, ask me. You can also, of course, find me on Twitter. Love Twitter. I'm available at Lefevre. And, of course, our company page is at Xojo. I mentioned the coupon code. Write it down. Make sure you take advantage of it when you're ready to purchase. I also want to remind people that, and this is quite a ways away, but we'd like to, get the date out there for people to start thinking about. XDC is the Xojo Developer Conference, and it is next year. So April 25th to 27th, 2018 in Denver, Colorado, which should be a great location. You can read more about it at xojo.com/XDC. Early registration is open now, so think about it. There's usually about 30 to 40 sessions, usually pretty detailed sessions, some by Xojo engineers and staff, some by Xojo customers. It's a great learning experience, great place to meet other Xojo developers and find out what they've created, how they're using Xojo. So check out the website, the page for XDC, and think about registering if it's something that makes sense for you. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a great day.